Good morning. Breaking news over the weekend was heartfelt and painful. 4 hostages who had been in captivity for more than 246 days since October 7th were rescued by Israeli special forces. They were being held in Gaza in an apartment building by apparent civilians. One was a physician and the other was his son, who was a well-known international journalist. Both of these individuals were killed, as well as others, in this rescue operations. The folks who are now back home with their families, they were Noah Argamani, Olmog Mayer, Andrei Kolsov, and Shlomi Ziv. We all watched in horror when Hamas distributed on the internet various videos of abductions taking place at the Nova Music Festival. That included video of Noah being put onto a motorcycle and screaming, "Please don't kill me." Well, we are all so grateful that these hostages are home and safe after this long ordeal. It's a blessing that Noah was home in time to see her mother, who was in the last stages of cancer. But sadly, Olmog, whose father has been devastated since October, died of a heart attack just hours before his release. Now, this entire war in Israel-Palestine that has worn on now for nearly 8 months is devastating to all. I am hoping, as so many are, for a ceasefire, for a release of the hostages, for an end to the war, for a rebuilding of Gaza, and for peace and justice going forward. I'm pleased that Joe Biden had put forward such a plan, and apparently the Israeli cabinet is in support of it, but Netanyahu seems to be dragging his feet. As we all know, he wants to stay in power. He has committed fraud before. He has put a coalition together that has put people in his coalition and on his cabinet, including Ben-Gvir, who Israel determined was a terrorist. So he is staying in power and supporting an endless war. I do hope that that changes. And there is more news coming out of the Middle East. President Joe Biden has done something that is almost miraculous. He managed to, in Matt Stoller's words, break OPEC. What I mean by that is that Joe Biden has influenced OPEC, which is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, which has been around since 1960. He influenced them in such a way that they are now voluntarily increasing the supply of crude oil, which will mean that the price of petrol, the price at the pump, will go down. How he managed to do this is quite unique. He did it by acting like a businessman, something that Donald Trump claims that he will do, but has never done. So specifically, what Joe Biden did was this. 2 years ago, you may remember, as COVID restrictions were opening up and people really wanted to travel, to just shop, to use their cars. At that time, gas at the pump was over $5 a gallon, and people were putting stickers on the pump blaming Joe Biden for this. And what Joe Biden ended up doing is releasing around 180 million barrels of oil from our strategic oil reserve in the United States. And usually this is something that is done in a smaller amount for particular types of emergency situations. In this case, he released that oil for the purpose of selling it on the market, right? So he's releasing it. He sold it at about $100 a barrel. And then prices went down because he was increasing supply in the marketplace and because traders were worried that Joe Biden was going to continue to release oil and that prices were going to continue to go down. So they were trying to get out of their position. So Joe sells at 100, sells high, and then he buys it back low at $70 a share. In this process, he's like replenishing the strategic oil reserve. And I think the number is, according to energy analyst Dan Dicker, Joe Biden made between $5 to $6 billion for the U.S. Treasury. I don't know why this is not getting more attention. It's possibly the case because it's kind of bound up in this question about about climate change. We want people to drive less. And there are arguments that if the price of gas is higher, then people will drive less, or they will have purchase smaller cars or more energy efficient cars or electric vehicles. And I get that argument. And that's the place we should go. However, in the short term, the only thing that happens when gas prices at the pump go up is the president who is in office loses. And it's not my opinion. This is reality based on what polling says and what the chief economist for Moody's says, Mark Zandi. So I want to give you this polling data because this is super, super important. According to polls from May, before Joe Biden accomplished this feat, 30% of voters said that gas prices at the pump were the most important economic factor to them. And the voters in those states that felt that way said they trusted Donald Trump more than Joe Biden to handle the issue. And that was a 49 to 32% margin. Okay, that's setting the stage. Now, let me tell you what chief economist for Moody's Analytics said. This is Mark Zandi. He wrote an opinion piece in May for CNN. And I'm going to quote this because this is so critical to us. Based on my econometric analysis of past presidential election outcomes, looking at the state electoral college vote, which accounts for a wide range of political and economic factors, if gasoline falls toward $3 a gallon by election day, President Joe Biden should win re-election. That's the magic number. However, he goes on, if pump prices rise to more than $4, former President Donald Trump is more likely to prevail. This is really important data. So first, we have the polling. Then I provided you with an opinion from an economist who is an expert in this issue and has studied past elections. Now let me get you a piece of history. So OPEC has been around since 1960. It was formed in Iraq, and it was very powerful in the 1970s. And what those of us who were around at that time remember is that in 1979, after the Iranian Revolution, when gas prices were going through the roof, and because the supply was restricted by the OPEC nations, inflation was rampant. And inflation was skyrocketing in large part because the price of oil is a big part of the calculation for consumer price inflation. So as a result of inflation, while Jimmy Carter was in office, his then chair of the Federal Reserve, Paul Volcker, wanted to break the back of inflation, and he let interest rates go up into the double digits, into the 20s, into the 20%. This made the public furious. People who had variable interest rates on their credit cards found themselves struggling to make payments. Similarly, people who had variable rate mortgages were struggling. Many of us believe that this cost Jimmy Carter the election, that and the hostage crisis. So this is really important news. I'm going to keep my eye on the price of gasoline. Okay, there was some other news back in the U.S. this weekend that I need to warn you isn't really new news, but I want to talk about it. I was seeing on social media people saying that Mike Pence, the former vice president, had announced that he is not voting for Donald Trump. However, back in March, he announced that he wasn't endorsing Donald Trump in this election. So that's not news. But what is still interesting and worth discussing is what took him so long between January of 2021 and March of 2024. We're talking more than 3 years. He wasn't sure what he was going to do. Remember, Donald Trump was standing up in front of a large, angry MAGA mob and telling them that he was angry at Mike Pence, and he was hoping that Mike Pence would do the right thing.
Because if Mike Pence does the right thing, we win the election. All he has to do, this is from the number one, or certainly one of the top constitutional lawyers in our country. He has the absolute right to do it. We're supposed to protect our country, support our Constitution, and protect our Constitution. States want to revote. The states got defrauded. They were given false information. They voted on it. Now they want to recertify. They want it back. All Vice President Pence has to do is send it back to the states to recertify. And we become president, and you are the happiest people.
This is right before, on January 6th, they were going to, there was this joint session of Congress where it's supposed to be just pro forma, where they open up the votes of the electoral college from the states and say, yes, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris won. That was what was supposed to happen. But he wanted Mike Pence to throw out those votes. And so he was attacking Pence, and he was not objecting to the crowd that was shouting, hang Mike Pence. You might remember that these folks left the ellipse where Donald Trump was giving his stop the steal type speech and marched over to the Capitol, where they had hung up a gallows. And they violently stormed the building, searching for Mike Pence, who barely escaped with his life. We've seen the video. So it is shocking that it took him so long to finally say he would not support Donald Trump. And so I've asked myself, what took him so long? Perhaps he needed to consult with his top advisors, one being Mother, and the other could also be his pet fly. I don't know. Despite all of this, Mike Pence has not given up his future ambitions to run for president, despite his poor showing this cycle. Okay, it's time for me to turn to Crazy Town if I can get Ponzu to stop barking. Crazy Town today is in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And that's where we come to find out that a yoga school was actually a full-blown cult. And according to reporting from the New York Times, and I'm going to quote this, the leader of the school coerced some of its female members into prostitution and laundered the profits in real estate. So the fact that a cult turns out to be a sex cult is not at all shocking, given that most cults I've learned about have centered on a charismatic male leader who employs coercive control techniques to exploit people financially and also to engage in sexual abuse and coercion against female members. Given that this seems to be sort of the model, and often that leader allows other members of the male members of the cult to have these prerogatives without the actual consent of the women in the cult that kind of keeps them there. This wasn't all that surprising to me. This reminds me of an excellent new Netflix documentary series. It's just 3 episodes and it's called Dancing for the Devil. Anyone who has seen some excellent dancers on Reels or on TikTok may recognize some of these folks and be understandably worried about those who are still apparently in this organization that combines a management company called 7M and a church called Shekinah, which involves the similar allegations of financial exploitation and sexual coercion. Please let me know if you are aware of other good documentaries on this topic. I'm mildly obsessed with this for the reason that I believe the folks in MAGA are low-key in a coercive control cult, which is quite unusual in that you can leave. It's not like they're physically contained inside of a compound or inside of a building, and yet they still seem to worship a man who has financially exploited his followers. Think Trump University. Think of the way he fundraises for his own legal fees. And think of the way he models this kind of sexual coercion and sexual assault and encourages members of MAGA to deny that the victims have suffered and to completely defame them when they come forward. That's what I got for you. See you tomorrow.